Welcome back to the deep dive. So today we're
Okay.
we're going to open up the source material not just to look at a bit of legal history, but to confront a pretty terrifying question, really.
It is.
At what point does institutional corruption stop being just, a crime, something with a fine or maybe some jail time, and start becoming an act of national betrayal?
It's such a crucial question, and this particular deep dive is, I think, remarkable because
Yeah.
the sources force us to reach across, well, over 1,000 years of legal
A
tradition
thousand years, yeah.
and multiple continents to really grapple with it. We're looking at how completely different society, through these huge political shifts, have consistently tried to define the integrity of public and judicial office.
And that's exactly the mission. We are pulling out these foundational principles from what is, I have to say, a dense but a truly brilliant collection of source material.
It really is.
We're drawing specifically from excerpts of Justice Unbound, The Global Fight Against Institutional Corruption, and focusing heavily on the analysis they present in their episode 88. So for you listening, our goal is really to extract the core legal, the philosophical nuggets that define these boundaries of public trust.
What's immediately fascinating about the source's approach here is that it's not constrained by, chronological order or any kind of geographic convenience.
Yeah.
It uses this sort of jurisprudential archaeology, digging up this incredibly dramatic ancient case from the Seljuk Persian era,
Right.
and then establishing a direct, unbroken conceptual link to modern anti-corruption battles. Battles being waged today everywhere from the French Court of Cassation to the Supreme Court of Pakistan.
And what immediately sets the tone, what establishes that high bar we're talking about, is the foundational idea right at the top of the source material. It just comes right out and states that corruption is fundamentally not a financial problem.
Not at its root.
Not at its root.
Mm-hmm.
It is seen as, and this is the powerful phrase we really need to unpack, treason against the Constitution and against the people.
And that phrase is a total game changer. It instantly elevates the entire discussion.
Gosh.
It means we're not dealing with, simple white-collar crime anymore. We're talking about an existential threat. The source is making the argument that when public servants consciously betray the public trust for their own private gain, whether it's financial or political, they are attacking the very structure, the very legitimacy of the system they swore an oath to uphold.
Right. And if you think about it, if the penalty for, say, embezzlement is a fine, and the penalty for treason is something much, much more severe, then calling institutional corruption treason just fundamentally changes the kind of institutional response that's required.
It has to.
But to illustrate this incredibly high standard, the source takes us way back in time. It takes us to a case that sets a, frankly, shockingly high precedent for judicial conduct that I think modern courts are still struggling to consistently meet. Okay, so let's unpack this story. We have to set the scene. We're in the height of the Seljuk Persian era. This was a sophisticated, vast empire.
Huge, yeah.
It was defined by its centralized administration, but it was also, prone to these intense power struggles between the royal authority, the Sultan, and his chief bureaucrats, mainly the Viziers.
And this specific anecdote, this story, is chosen by the sources for a very good reason. It's because it places the absolute maximum stress on the system.
It's a pressure test.
It's a perfect pressure test. It's an illustration of executive power personified by the Vizier, testing the ultimate limits of judicial independence. The Vizier, who was, for all intents and purposes, the Sultan's prime minister.
Right, the top official.
The highest appointed official in the entire administrative structure. And he needed a favorable ruling in a simple property case.
And what does the source material tell us about how he went about it? It certainly wasn't subtle.
No, not at all.
The sheer scale of the attempted corruption kind of reveals everything, doesn't it? It reveals the stakes and the arrogance of the power involved. So what did the Vizier offer the judge to secure this ruling?
He offered the judge a luxury mansion.
Wow.
And we really need to pause on that detail for a second. This wasn't, a basket of fruit or a bag of gold coins slipped under the table.
Yeah.
This was an attempt to confer permanent aristocratic wealth and security upon the judge and his entire family for generations. In that era, what the Vizier was offering was a life-changing economic and social status upgrade. It was a bribe designed to be absolutely irresistible.
The implication there is just so clear. The Vizier believed his power was absolute. He thought it extended even into the supposedly independent chambers of the Judiciary.
He saw justice as something that could be managed.
Purchased.
Purchased, exactly. Like any other administrative problem you could just solve with enough resources. And the vizier's influence was immense. I mean, it touched everything from military appointments to tax collection. So for him to personally intervene in a civil dispute, especially by offering such a lavish bribe, it shows the executive branch attempting to functionally swallow the judicial branch whole. It was a declaration of unchecked power.
But here, this is where where history really pivots. It's the judge's response. It wasn't just a rejection. It was this deep ethical and philosophical refusal of the very premise that justice could be negotiable.
And it was immediate. It was total.
Yeah.
And this brings us to what is arguably the most powerful and enduring quote in the entire source material. It's a maxim that has echoed through legal philosophy for centuries. The Seljuk judge looked at this offer and responded, "A judge who takes gifts becomes a slave. Justice is not sold."
Becomes a slave. We really have to break down the philosophical and the legal weight of that specific word, slave, in this context. I mean, why didn't he just say indebted or compromise? Why that word?
The term slave carries a very, very specific weight here,
Yeah.
far beyond just financial debt. Philosophically, a slave has no autonomy.
None.
Their will is completely subjugated to their master's will. So by accepting the vizier's gift, that mansion, the judge recognized that he would immediately lose his single most crucial asset as a judge, his independence.
Right.
He would no longer be a free servant of the law. He would become a subordinate of the vizier or, any future more powerful person who came along with a bigger bribe.
So his moral authority, his very ability to execute justice impartially, would be just fundamentally annihilated.
Gone.
He'd be serving the vizier's private interest, not the public's, constitutional right to justice.
Precisely. The judge understood that the integrity of judicial decision-making relies entirely, 100%, on absolute impartiality. The second that standard is compromised by accepting a substantial gift, the judge has ceased to function as a legitimate officer of justice. He becomes morally and institutionally owned.
Which makes all of his future decisions suspect.
Every single one. It transforms justice, which is supposed to be this foundational, non-commercial public right, into just another marketable commodity, something available only to the political and economic elite. And this violation of that foundational contract with the people is what makes him a slave to that influence.
But the judge didn't just stop there, did he? I mean, a mere refusal, however courageous, might have just left the vizier in power, ready to try again with the next judge.
Oh, absolutely. He would have just moved on to the next target.
And this is where the judge escalated from what was, passive ethical refusal into active institutional resistance.
Yes. The subsequent actions are what elevated this case from a personal moral victory into a profound institutional precedent. The source details this sequence of 4 really radical steps that took direct aim at the executive power structure.
Okay, so the first, naturally, was just rejecting the bribe outright. But what was the critical second step?
The second step, he didn't rely on, office gossip or some quiet internal complaint. He wrote a formal, detailed report directly to the Sultan.
Oh, yeah.
This was a systemic declaration. He framed the attempted bribe not as some minor ethical violation, but as a crisis of state governance, a direct threat to the Sultan's own authority to dispense justice fairly across his realm. He was bypassing the entire administrative chain of command that the vizier controlled.
That's just an extraordinary act of bravery. He was potentially staking his career, maybe even his life, on the Sultan's commitment to institutional integrity over, political convenience.
And then step 3 was even more demanding.
Right.
It was the ultimate institutional challenge. He didn't ask for personal protection. He didn't ask for a transfer to a safer post somewhere else. He demanded the vizier be immediately removed from office.
Not just investigated, but removed.
Removed. This shows that the judge understood the risk wasn't the bribe itself. It was the corrupting influence being wielded from the absolute highest echelons of power. He saw the vizier himself as a systemic threat that had to be excised for the health of the entire government.
And then the fourth action, which I think really solidified the public nature of his stand, was demanding a public inquiry. This wasn't about some private vendetta.
No.
It was about restoring public confidence.
Exactly. The request for public inquiry ensured that the whole process of accountability would be transparent. It sent a signal to the entire empire, to the vizier's rivals, to the public, to future officials, that judicial integrity was not only enforced, but it was seen to be enforced. This was a direct mechanism for maintaining public trust in the independence of the courts.
So this wasn't passive self-defense at all. It was an active, aggressive demand for systemic change. But, I mean, wasn't this move inherently self-destructive, given the vizier's power? What on earth protected the judge?
And that is the core tension here, isn't it? The judge's only protection was the Seljuk system's own, albeit monarchical, commitment to justice as a foundation of its own legitimacy.
So he was betting on the system itself.
He was. If the Sultan had sided with the Vizier, the judge would likely have been swiftly and severely punished. But the Sultan, recognizing the existential threat posed by a compromised judiciary, which would, in turn, delegitimize his own rule, responded decisively.
And the result was accountability, delivered with a speed that, frankly, modern systems often envy.
The Sultan immediately ordered a formal investigation based on the judge's report. The consequence was swift, and it was total. The powerful Vizier was dismissed from his post and permanently banned from ever holding any form of public office again.
That is just a staggering historical precedent. It confirms that centuries ago, the attempted corruption of the judiciary by the highest member of the executive branch wasn't treated as some political inconvenience.
No.
It was treated as a fundamental breach of state security and trust,
Right.
requiring the highest possible systemic response.
It established the legal and moral bar right then and there. Institutional corruption demands the removal of the corrupting influence, completely irrespective of their power or their utility to the state. The Seljuk judge successfully forced the system to prioritize its own foundational integrity over political expediency.
So that single dramatic Seljuk case, it provides the entire philosophical bedrock for this whole deep dive. Now we transition, using the specific judicial principle that the source material extracts from that confrontation as our bridge to the modern world.
And that principle is really the central axis of our whole analysis. Judges must not only avoid corruption, they must be seen to fight it. This is the mandatory standard of institutional guardianship that was established by that judge's actions.
That distinction, the difference between avoiding and fighting, I think that's the most important takeaway for you listening. Avoidance is a passive thing, an internal integrity requirement. Fighting it is an active, external, institutional role. Let's break that difference down in a bit more detail.
The standard of avoiding corruption is, it's the minimum ethical threshold. It means you reject the bribe, you adhere to conflict of interest standards, you maintain your personal financial integrity.
It's passive.
It's a completely passive measure. It's just, I will not personally participate in the crime. It's absolutely necessary, of course, but it's totally insufficient when the threat is systemic.
Right. Because if the Seljuk judge had only avoided corruption, he would have just, returned the keys to the mansion, kept his mouth shut, and the Vizier would have just gone on to corrupt the next judge.
Exactly. Or influence the next decision through some other means. The corruption would persist even if that one judge himself remained personally queen.
So the avoidance standard is inherently limited. It's limited to the individual's conscience.
Right. But the principle of being seen to fight it, that's a mandate for active institutional transparency and accountability. It necessitates action against the corrupting force, even when that means confronting powerful officials who operate, way above the judge's administrative pay grade.
This principle fundamentally reframes the entire role of a judge. Under the avoidance model, the judge is just sort of a reactive administrator of existing law. But under this fighting model, the judge is mandated to be an active guardian of constitutional and state integrity.
And that has profound implications for the entire judiciary. It demands that judges not only have the ethical fortitude to resist temptation, but also the structural courage and the legal authority to expose these breaches of trust. It implies that if a judge knows of powerful institutional corruption and does nothing,
They're complicit.
they're passively aiding the betrayal of the people. They become complicit through their silence.
The structural implications of that are enormous, especially when you think about modern state systems. To fight corruption, the institution itself needs mechanisms for protected internal reporting. It necessitates robust whistleblower protections for judicial staff and for judges themselves.
It does.
It implies that transparency in handling corruption allegations isn't just, good governance. It's fundamental to maintaining public confidence in the judicial branch as a whole.
The Seljuk judge, by demanding that public inquiry and the Vizier's removal, was essentially acting as an institutional whistleblower and demanding systemic remediation. He understood that the institution's legitimacy was rooted in its perceived freedom from influence, which is why the fight had to be public. That decision to actively challenge the executive, to purify the system, That is the true legacy of this historical event.
So, okay, how does the success of this one ancient, incredibly courageous judge scale up to the challenges facing a large, modern democratic state? I mean, the complexity of 21st century finance and politics makes a mansion bribe look almost quaint.
Well, the source material argues that while the mechanisms of corruption have certainly changed, the fundamental philosophical threat has not.
Hmm.
The question is still the same. Is the state capable of purging corruption from its own highest ranks? And the source emphatically directly links this high Seljuk standard to the reasoning of modern courts.
It's a powerful connection. It transcends legal traditions from, the ancient religious and philosophical foundations of the Seljuk courts, all the way to the secular civil law systems of France and the common law traditions adopted in Pakistan.
The recognition is universal. The idea that institutional integrity must be actively defended it's everywhere.
Okay, so our journey takes us first to Western Europe and to the French parallel, which the source uses to show this modern articulation of internal betrayal. Let's look at the infamous Clearstream scandal of 2006. This was, a seismic event in French politics and jurisprudence.
Oh, absolutely. The Clearstream affair was a crisis that exposed the really intricate and often very shadowy relationship between high-level politicians, intelligence services, and these global financial mechanisms. At its core, it was about sophisticated, politically motivated manipulation.
Yeah, this wasn't simple theft. Let's detail the nature and the mechanics of the corruption that was investigated. We're talking about political sabotage, financial manipulation, and this crucial element, the forging of lists of illegal accounts.
Right. So the corruption here involved creating and then disseminating these fabricated lists that falsely implicated high-profile political and business figures, including presidential candidates, I should add in, holding secret illegal accounts at Clearstream, which is a big clearinghouse based in Luxembourg.
So what was the goal?
The goal was really twofold. First, to politically destabilize your rivals, and second, to deflect attention from genuine underlying corruption that likely involved the very actors who were orchestrating the forgery.
So instead of just taking money, the corrupt act was using the instruments of the state, or those closely aligned with it, to literally manufacture evidence and conduct political warfare. It's corruption as a form of systemic sabotage.
Precisely. And this type of corruption is far more corrosive than a traditional bribe because it attacks the truth-finding functions of the state itself. When the intelligence and political apparatus are being used to forge documents and frame opponents, the public can no longer trust the very institutions that are designed to protect them. The judicial system had to step in because the corruption went right to the heart of the political elite.
And the highest court in France, the Court of Cassation, which is their court of last resort for civil and criminal matters, it intervened, and it applied a principle that just echoes that Seljuk moral imperative. What was their powerful holding on the nature of this crime?
Their key phrase, which the source highlights as a central tenet of modern anti-corruption jurisprudence, was this: corruption erodes the republic from within.
Erodes the republic from within. Let's just analyze that language for a moment. It uses the metaphor of erosion, this slow structural decay. How does that powerful phrasing mirror that ancient Seljuk moral lesson that a nation falls not when enemies attack, but when its own officials lose honesty?
It really emphasizes the slow internal nature of the threat. An enemy attack is sudden and external. It usually rallies the populace.
Right, you see it coming.
You see it coming. Erosion is gradual, it's subtle, and it's often invisible until the foundation completely collapses. And by using the term republic, the court underscores that the victim here is not a specific bank or an individual, but the entire system of self-governance, the sovereignty of the people. Corruption hollows out the functional capacity and the legitimacy of the state from the inside, making it vulnerable to external pressures or simply rendering it incapable of delivering justice or good governance.
So it transforms the illicit activity from a specific statutory offense like forgery into a systemic threat against the democratic contract itself.
Exactly.
It perfectly mirrors the Seljuk judge's recognition that the Vizier's bribe wasn't just a personal matter between them, but a breach of state integrity.
And just as the Seljuk Vizier was removed, the judicial outcome in the Clearstream affair confirmed the seriousness of this diagnosis. Key high-level figures who were involved in orchestrating the forgeries and manipulating the system were prosecuted, they were fined, and they were sentenced to imprisonment. The judiciary affirmed its role as the ultimate defender of the republic's structure, holding these powerful officials accountable for their acts of internal sabotage.
Okay, now let's pivot. Geographically and jurisprudentially. We're shifting focus to the Supreme Court of Pakistan, moving into a common law jurisdiction that is grappling with institutional corruption on a massive, highly visible scale. The sources cite several landmark judgments that establish a really consistent legal philosophy.
They do. And these cases are globally significant in the study of accountability. You have the Panama case of 2017, numerous NAB references, NAB being the National Accountability Bureau, so those are proceedings initiated by the Anti-Corruption Agency. And then crucial cases like the sugar and wheat inquiry cases. And these cases cover, everything from the misuse of offshore assets to the manipulation of essential commodities that directly affect the daily lives of citizens.
So across all these diverse and, let's be honest, politically charged rulings, what are the core philosophical principles that the Supreme Court consistently emphasized?
The sources distill three common judicial emphases. First, they define public office not merely as a job, but as being fundamentally equal to public trust.
Public trust.
This is critical because it immediately imports fiduciary duties, a requirement to act in the best interest of the beneficiary, who in this case is the entire citizenry.
That sets the ethical bar immensely high. It imposes a duty that far exceeds just standard bureaucratic behavior.
Absolutely. Second, and this is perhaps the most powerful legal concept the Pakistani courts have wielded, is their definition of illicit or unexplained wealth acquired through public office. They classify this not as mere theft or tax evasion, but as a breach of constitutional morality.
We need to spend some significant time on that phrase, breach of constitutional morality. That is not a term you find casually in every legal system. What exactly does it entail? And how does it differ from just statutory immorality or simple criminal acts?
So, constitutional morality is the set of shared foundational ethical principles, honesty, impartiality, justice, accountability, that really underpin the written constitution and make the democratic system viable. It's the ethical spirit of the law.
The spirit of the law.
Exactly. A breach of constitutional morality implies a violation of that foundational unwritten contract between the state functionary and the people. It's an ethical crime against the system itself.
So just so I understand, an official might be found innocent of a specific statutory crime, maybe because of a lack of hard evidence, but the court can still rule that their actions like having vast unexplained wealth or clear conflicts of interest constitute a betrayal of the constitutional contract.
Precisely.
And that would render them unfit for office.
Precisely. It allows the judiciary to enforce integrity even where specific criminal codes might fail to capture the full scope of the betrayal. In the Panama case, for example, this concept was applied to assess the honesty and trustworthiness of high officials, specifically linking their failure to explain assets to a fundamental inability to meet the high ethical bar required by the Constitution. They violated the spirit of the document, which is a structural betrayal.
And what about those commodity manipulation cases, like the sugar and wheat inquiry? How did they fit into this framework?
Well, those cases showed institutional corruption acting directly against the economic welfare of the populace. They involved powerful cartels and politicians manipulating subsidies, hoarding essential goods, and controlling prices to generate massive illicit profits,
Which often resulted
in widespread food shortages and inflation for the average citizen. The court ruled that this systematic theft of national resources and the manipulation of markets for basic necessities was a direct attack on the people's right to welfare, a clear breach of the constitutional duty to protect the populace.
And that leads right into the third major emphasis from the Pakistani Supreme Court, which ties directly back to the Seljuk judge's active role. The court emphasized that the judiciary has a constitutional mandate to protect national resources.
And that is the modern articulation of the mandate to fight corruption. The judiciary is not merely a passive adjudicator in these cases. It views itself as the active constitutional guardian of the nation's wealth, its land, and its economic stability against internal predation.
Wow.
By defining illicit wealth as a violation of constitutional morality, they are legally justifying their aggressive intervention into political and financial affairs to fulfill that mandate.
But I have to ask, isn't defining and then enforcing constitutional morality a dangerously subjective standard? Doesn't that invite judicial overreach into policy and, political turf wars?
That is the inherent tension, and it's one the source material absolutely notes. The justification for using such a broad ethical standard is driven by the sheer scale of the institutional corruption they were facing.
It's a response to a crisis.
It's an extreme remedy for an extreme threat. When the executive and legislative branches fail so fundamentally to self-regulate, the judiciary feels compelled to invoke this broader, foundational, ethical contract constitutional morality to prevent the state from collapsing from within. It echoes the Seljuk judge's decision to risk his career to excise the Vizier. It confirms the standard is active guardianship, not passive avoidance.
So whether the attack is an ancient vizier trying to buy a ruling, a modern French intelligence operative forging lists to sabotage rivals, or a Pakistani official manipulating commodity prices for private gain, the ultimate diagnosis from the judiciary across centuries and continents is the same. This is internal sabotage of the state structure. So we've now synthesized 1,000 years of legal philosophy across 3 completely distinct traditions. This entire investigation has been building up to the central legal synthesis from the source material, the core reason for the decision. The ratio decidendi.
This is it. This is where the historical precedent and all these modern legal principles converge into one definitive, actionable judicial conclusion. It is really the philosophical culmination of this entire deep dive.
Let's reiterate the core ratio, because it is the ultimate conclusion of this global comparative analysis, and it is this. Corruption is treason against the Constitution and against the people.
And we have to elaborate fully on the choice of that word, treason. Treason, historically, is the highest crime against the state.
Highest.
It's typically reserved for acts of war against the sovereign or giving aid and comfort to foreign enemies. So why does institutional corruption, a crime of money and power, deserve to be elevated to the same legal category as espionage or armed rebellion?
Right. Traditionally, treason involves an external threat or some kind of overt violence. Framing corruption as treason is a pretty radical redefinition of what constitutes the gravest internal threat.
It fundamentally redefines the nature of betrayal. The rationale is that institutional corruption subverts the internal mechanisms that are designed to guarantee fair and constitutional governance. If the system for dispensing justice, managing finance, allocating resources, if that system is betrayed by its own trustees,
The state can't function.
the state's functional sovereignty is destroyed. It is a peaceful, internal destruction of the state's legitimacy.
And the phrase against the people is so key there. If the people are the ultimate sovereign in a constitutional system and the government only acts as their trustee, then stealing from the public or subverting the rule of law for private gain is a direct, conscious betrayal of that sovereignty.
It is placing the private, personal interest of the official above the existential survival of the political community.
It elevates the crime from just a financial transgression to an existential crisis.
It absolutely does. The Seljuk case showed it, the Clearstream case showed it, and the Pakistani cases confirm it. Institutional financial crimes, when they are committed by those in public trust, are fundamentally existential threats. They delegitimize the state and they destroy the very foundation upon which law and order rest.
This classification also seems to provide the strongest possible legal mandate for judicial activism. If corruption is truly treason, then the judiciary isn't just adjudicating a breach of contract.
No.
It is obligated to be the counterinsurgency force, fighting the internal decay that threatens the foundation of the nation. It gives them the legal authority for the kind of aggressive, systemic responses we saw in all 3 historical examples.
And it forces us to confront that question. What is ultimately more damaging to a nation's stability? An external enemy attack that galvanizes unity, or the slow internal betrayal by one's own trusted officials that destroys the ability to trust anything or anyone?
Which brings us full circle, right back to the overarching moral lesson that the source material extracts from this deep historical and legal synthesis. It is a timeless warning.
The timeless moral lesson summarizes the existential threat perfectly. A nation falls not when enemies attack, but when its own officials lose honesty.
That sentiment just resonates, doesn't it? Whether it's expressed in ancient Persian courts or modern European jurisprudence. So for you listening, the takeaway here is really unambiguous. Whether it's a 10th century vizier trying to buy a property ruling with a mansion, or a 21st century scandal over hidden offshore accounts used for political manipulation, the fundamental threat to a nation's stability and longevity is always internal corruption. It's the failure of public honesty.
And the integrity standard demanded by that one Seljuk judge to not just avoid corruption, which is, frankly, easy to promise, but to actively fight it, publicly and institutionally, that remains the ultimate, timeless global standard for every single public servant. The law demands courage.
It's a compelling argument, I think, for the essential role of an activist, fearless judiciary in safeguarding constitutional morality and the public contract. We've navigated centuries of complex legal philosophy in this deep dive, but let's just take a moment to crystallize the key nuggets and quotes that define this essential understanding of public trust and betrayal. These are the principles that should really stick with you.
First, that foundation of judicial independence and the nature of institutional servitude captured perfectly by the Seljuk judge. A judge who takes gifts becomes a slave. Justice is not sold.
Second, the proactive, modern standard that's required of all public servants moving beyond just passive ethics. Judges must not only avoid corruption, they must be seen to fight it.
Third, that powerful diagnosis of the crime's severity, drawn from the French Court of Cassation during the Clearstream affair. Corruption erodes the republic from within.
And finally, the ultimate legal synthesis that the source material provides, tying everything together. Corruption is treason against the Constitution and against the people. Understanding these deep historical roots and this consistent international consensus, it strengthens your capacity to analyze modern political accountability movements and the continuous struggle to define the boundaries of ethical public service. You now have the language and the history to frame these struggles in existential terms.
And as we close this deep dive, there is one final provocative thought to maybe mull over, building directly on the source material's conclusion about the ultimate threat to the state. If the failure of official honesty is universally agreed upon as being more dangerous than an invading army, how should contemporary constitutional systems be explicitly structured, not just legally, but financially and institutionally, to incentivize the fighting of corruption, rather than just relying on that minimal, easily subverted standard of avoiding it?
That's the question. Does the risk of exposure, the lack of protected institutional mechanisms, or just the sheer promise of political promotion still outweigh the high historical and legal standards set by that one Seljuk judge who demanded the dismissal of the most powerful man in the state? That is the structural challenge for every modern democracy.
Thank you for joining us for this journey into the deep history and the urgent present of justice and public trust.
We'll catch you next time for another deep dive.